Welcome to the Deep Dive. We grab a whole stack of sources, dive in, and pull out the key insights for you.
Yeah, making sense of it all.
So today we're looking at something really fascinating, kind of at the crossroads of language, identity, and, well, power dynamics. Autistic communication. Specifically, we're going to unpack this term you hear in behavioral science, vocal stereotypy.
Right, and how that term, how it's used scientifically, is just worlds apart from how many autistic people actually see their own voices.
And our main guide here is an article by Jaime Hoerricks, a PhD. It's called If You Can't Make Sense of Us, You Silence Us. Quite a title.
It is, and it digs into vocal stereotypy, behavioral science, and what the author calls the erasure of autistic voice. It's partly a response to a recent 2025 study on using music to, well, reduce autistic vocalizations.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is to really get into the language here, explore these very different views on what communication even is.
And what's actually at stake, when some ways of expression get labeled non-functional or get targeted.
Yeah, like what gets lost. It's about understanding different ways people use their voice, use language, maybe rethinking some basics.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's jump right into that term. Vocal stereotypy. How does the source say behavioral science defines it?
Well, the article lays it out pretty clearly. In the standard literature, it's basically repetitive vocalizations that are considered non-functional. That's the sort of clinical definition.
Non-functional. And the sourse flags that immediately, right? Saying, hang on, that's not a term autistic people typically use for themselves.
Not at all. Hoerricks really presents it as kind of a behaviorist invention designed to classify sounds that make other people uncomfortable or confused.
So the issue isn't just the definition, it's the assumption baked right into it, this non-functional bit.
Exactly. That's the core critique. The article asks, whose function are we talking about and by what standard? It argues that definition just completely ignores any internal meaning, any resonance it might have for the person actually making the sound. It only cares about external use. Can someone else understand it easily?
And the source even gives us a bit of word history for stereotypy. Where does that come from?
Yeah, it's interesting. It comes from printing, apparently. Those old solid metal plates, making identical copies.
Ah, okay.
And the source argues that when psychology grabbed that metaphor, it brought along that feeling of, rigid sameness, duplication, and applied it to behavior, to language, maybe implying there's no internal variation or thought behind it.
Which, the source argues, leads to this view where language is only good if it's useful to others, if it's easily understood from the outside.
Precisely. And if it involves repetition or patterns that don't have an obvious external purpose, it gets marked as a problem, like a system malfunction.
It just kind of flattens the whole experience, the potential meaning.
That's the source's point, yeah. Flattening autistic voices.
Okay, so if you start there, believing these sounds are problems, well, then you try to stop them. The source talks about methods used.
It does. Several behavioral interventions aimed at reducing or, eliminating these behaviors, labeled as vocal stereotypy.
One is called RRD, response interruption and redirection. What does that look like?
The article describes it as an adult basically stopping the vocalization as it happens, sometimes literally mid-sound.
Oh, wow.
And then immediately prompting or demanding something else, often like a specific request for an item or activity.
And the source's take on that is pretty critical, it sounds like, not really about teaching communication.
Not in the way you might think. Hoerricks argues, yeah, it works, but it works at silencing the original sound and training compliance. It's teaching the person to substitute a different behavior, one the adult wants, instead of trying to figure out what the first sound was about. The source says it treats the original vocalization like noise pollution, just something to get rid of.
Okay. Then there's the method from that 2025 study NCM, non-contingent music. Using that.
Right. The source sees this as basically displacement. You flood the person's sensory environment with music to, override their own vocalization.
So you're not listening to them.
No, you're actively trying to cancel out their sound with other sound. The source calls it noise cancellation. It stops the vocalization, sure, but doesn't engage with why the person might have been making it.
There's also stimulus control mentioned, like using colored cards. Green means go, red means stop.
Yeah, teaching the person when it's okay to make certain sounds. The source is really sharp on this, calling it the regimenting of voice, like literally policing of sound.
Yeah.
And it poses that really important question. What's the ethical cost here? What internal needs, self-regulation, communication, just feeling okay, are being ignored or sacrificed when your voice is controlled like that?
And technology gets pulled in, too. AI tracking.
The source mentions programs designed to detect and monitor these vocalizations automatically.
And the framing there is?
Surveillance dressed as care. That's the phrase used. It's seen as algorithmic control, a way to automate and scale up this silencing process, or at least an approximation of silence.
So if you look at all these methods, RIRD, NCM, stimulus control, AI, what's the source's unifying argument about what they're really doing?
The core argument is that whatever the stated therapeutic goal, the fundamental motive driving these techniques is the suppression of the autistic voice.
Okay.
They all start from that same place, assuming these vocalizations are inherently problematic. And that leads, in the source's words, to behavioral silencings.
And the article connects these current practices back to historical roots, doesn't it? Specifically looking at ABA, Applied Behavioral Analysis, and its founder, Oli Ivar-Loves.
It does, yeah. This is a really significant section. The article cites a 2025 study by someone named Desjardins, which claims Loves was actually a teenage leader in a fascist youth group during the Nazi occupation of Norway.
Wow, okay. And the source sees that not just as a biographical detail, but as potentially influential?
Right. Hoerricks argues this wasn't just some incidental footnote, but possibly formative for his later worldview and work. Again, that's the source's interpretation based on the cited study.
And how does the source interpret Lovias's famous goal, making autistic children indistinguishable from their peers?
The argument presented in the article is that this goal wasn't really about inclusion or helping children thrive as autistic individuals. It was about erasure, about enforcing conformity to neurotypical standards.
So the source is essentially saying that the foundational logic of ABA right from the start was about eliminating difference.
That's the claim being made, yes. And the source argues that this legacy carries through today. You see it, the article suggests, in how undesirable behaviors are measured and targeted without asking about their meaning for the person, in replacing things like echolalia with prompted functional requests, and even in how funding often rewards observable compliance rather than, say, building genuine connection or understanding.
Okay, so this critique of the methods in the history leads to a really important shift in thinking about communication itself. The source brings up the double empathy problem.
Ah, yes, Damian Milton's concept from 2012, super important.
Explain that a bit.
The core idea is that when communication breaks down between autistic and non-autistic people, it's not just a one-way street. It's not solely because of an autistic deficit. It's a mutual misunderstanding.
A two-way problem.
Exactly. And crucially, Milton and Hoerricks, building on this, point out that power imbalances mean that non-autistic communication styles usually get treated as the default, the right way.
Got it. And the source argues that when the system refuses to see autistic communication as valid,
then it's not just a simple misunderstanding anymore. The source calls it epistemic violence or epistemic erasure.
Strong terms. What does that mean?
It means you're essentially denying the validity of a whole way of knowing, of experiencing the world and expressing that experience. You're saying their way of making sense isn't legitimate.
And the article actually points to research showing these non-functional sounds often do have meaning.
Absolutely. It references work on gestalt language processing, or GLP, and natural language acquisition, NLA, citing studies from way back in the 80s right up to today.
And what does that research show?
It suggests that things like echolalia, repeating words or phrases, or scripting, using lines from media, these aren't meaningless. They often serve really important functions. Communication, self-regulation, even language development for many autistic individuals.
But the source contrasts that with how behavioral approaches often treat the exact same things.
Right. Instead of exploring why someone is using echolalia, the focus is often on measuring it as a problem vocalization, charting how often it happens and trying to make the chart go down, actively suppressing it.
The source even calls out researchers who are maybe skeptical of GLP.
Yeah, it mentions work by Hutchins and others, Venker and Lorang too. The argument is that dismissing GLP findings reinforces this hierarchy where neuromajority ways of thinking are automatically privileged. It basically pathologizes autistic ways of communicating and understanding.
So what's the counterview this source offers? How should we see things like scripting or echolalia?
It reframes them completely. What might look like just an anecdote to an outsider, autistic people might recognize as a meaningful pattern. What seems quirky or idiosyncratic might feel deeply resonant, almost like an ancestral echo for the person. Scripting isn't seen as a communication failure, but as a form of storytelling. Making meaning by using language that resonates through rhythm, repetition, it's presented as a different kind of grammar, not a lack of grammar.
Really circles back to that fundamental question the source keeps asking.
It absolutely does. Hoerricks puts it so directly. It's not whether our communication has function, it's whose function the system cares about.
That really shifts the focus, doesn't it? Away from fixing the individual and onto questioning the system's openness.
Precisely.
Now, building on that idea of understanding the why, the source brings in another framework, PTMF, the power threat meaning framework.
Right. PTMF is an alternative way to think about distress or behaviors that seem unusual. Instead of asking, what's wrong with you, it asks, what has happened to you?
Okay. So looking at context, power dynamics, threats, how people make meaning of difficult situations.
Exactly. And the source applies this lens directly to vocal stimming, those self-stimulatory vocalizations.
So how does PTMF reframe vocal stimming? Not as a symptom.
No, not as just a symptom of autism. It reframes it as potentially a survival strategy, an embodied response to really difficult circumstances.
Like what kind of circumstances?
Things like sensory overload, feeling completely overwhelmed, social situations that feel confusing or threatening, or just the constant pressure some autistic people feel to mask to perform neurotypicality. The stimming is seen as a response to that pressure.
So from this perspective, the sounds aren't random. They're actually doing something important for the person.
That's the argument. The source suggests vocal stimming can help regulate the nervous system, like a release valve. It can be a way to hold on to memories, replay important phrases.
Communicate feelings, even.
Yes, communicate affect when maybe words fail, and even affirm one's own identity in a world that might be trying to suppress it. The source calls these sounds declarations, not disruptions.
The article uses some really evocative language to describe this, doesn't it? Trying to capture that internal experience.
It really does. It talks about stimming as like anchoring yourself, weaving meaning with sound, marking your place, making yourself feel real and legible to yourself.
Wow.
The nervous system reaching for rhythm, memory finding language, a sensory incantation is one phrase used. It paints a picture of deep internal purpose.
Which is just completely at odds with the idea of charting these behaviors on a graph to make them disappear.
Exactly. The source argues that approach fundamentally disrespects this potential meaning. It turns what could be seen as poetry, or at least profound self-regulation, into pathology.
And PTMF offers
a different path. A way to witness the person and their sounds. Instead of asking, how do we stop this? It asks, what might this person be saying with their stimming? What might they be doing for themselves? It's a radical shift.
So given all of this, the critique of the term, the methods, the history, the alternative frameworks, what's the main call to action from the source?
It's pretty direct. Retire the term vocal stereotypy. Just stop using it.
Why? Because the term itself is flawed.
Yes. The argument is that the term was constructed from a viewpoint designed to erase meaning, the very meaning we've been exploring. It's fundamentally incapable of describing these experiences respectfully or accurately.
So if not vocal stereotypy, what terms does the source suggest?
It offers alternatives like vocal stimming, gestalt utterance, or echolalic communication.
And the key difference is how these terms frame the behavior.
Exactly. They frame these sounds not as problems to be fixed, but as valid, meaningful modes of expression, of being present, of self-regulating, even of social signaling. As languages rooted in rhythm and resonance that deserve platforms, deserve to be heard and understood, not shut down.
This implies a pretty big shift in how support should work, too.
Huge. Moving away from just aiming for behavioral compliance towards what the source calls narrative translation.
Narrative translation.
Meaning actively trying to understand the story, the meaning behind the expressions, listening deeply. It calls for support models developed with autistic people, not just imposed on them. It mentions Valentino and Domain as examples of researchers pushing for this collaborative approach.
And the source suggests there might be resistance to this shift, particularly from some parts of the behavioral industry.
Yeah, there's a strong critique there. The argument is that future research absolutely needs to start from autistic knowledge and lived experience. It needs to be trauma-informed and participatory. But the source claims that some established parts of the ABA industry might avoid this kind of research because it would force a confrontation with the double empathy problem. It suggests the current system kind of needs autistic communication to remain difficult or illegible to justify certain interventions.
That's a provocative claim. And it leads to the source's final powerful assertion about what autistic people actually need.
Which is fundamentally not to be fixed, not to be made more palatable or comfortable for others.
But to be met where they are.
Exactly. To not have to abandon their authentic ways of being, communicating, and regulating themselves just to fit in.
There's that quote near the end.
Yes. We were never too loud. The frameworks were too brittle. That really sums up the source's perspective.
Wow, okay, that was definitely a deep dive. It really forces you to rethink basic ideas about voice and communication.
It highlights that huge gap between seeing autistic vocalizations as just problem behavior versus understanding them as potentially rich with meaning, function, and as survival tools.
Yeah, the source makes such a strong case that what gets dismissed as non-functional noise can actually be tied to identity, memory, self-regulation.
Yeah.
Vital stuff.
Absolutely vital.
And maybe the final thought to leave listeners with, something that really stuck out from the source.
Yeah.
It's this idea. The source suggests the real tragedy isn't just that autistic voices weren't always understood, it's that others assumed they had the right to decide what those voices were even for.
Ugh, yeah. That hits hard. It really challenges us to question who gets to define communication and whose perspective we prioritize.
Something to really chew on. Thanks for unpacking that with us.
Glad to. It's important stuff.